I did see, we did go finally to this exhibit at MoMA on video games.
Oh yeah, it was awful.
It was really not good.
No.
It was really, I mean, I don't think I've ever said like, oh, this exhibit is awful. It was just like, and I was like, oh, like one of my favorite, like, I don't really care very much about video games, but one of the few video games that I do love, Flower, was,
it's a beautiful game.
It is beautiful.
Yeah,
and it was like, here's a little like fucking 11-inch screen that you can see, and you can like tap something and it shows like two possible. I was trying to explain to my mother-in-law like the magic of Flower, who would have been like a very good audience for it as somebody who doesn't care about video games, but has like, an interesting aesthetic sense. And it was just like, literally you walked into this exhibit and it was like, hey, behind glass, here's like an iPod, and like here's like the power sign. And like, here's the @ sign. And it was like, it was supposed to be this, kind of persuasive argument about the ways that these innovations have shaped our consciousness. But instead it was this like incredibly flat kind of like, here are these artifacts of the last 20 years, which like, actually I did have an emotional connection to many of these. But it didn't do anything in terms. It was just inert. I don't know. What did you think, Patrick?
I thought it was poorly conceived. Like it was a small. I mean, and poorly executed. It was a tiny room. Like it was maybe 3 or 4 times as big as this room we're in right now,
which is not very big.
And they just put up some 2x4s and painted it all a light blue. And then there was just these screens and with occasional controllers that you could sort of play with a little bit and a couple.
Barely. It was like a mouse was connected to most of them.
It just and then there were a couple TVs just showing pretty screenshots, but not even, or like little clips, but in the way that you might see at like E3 or something, right? It just wasn't. It didn't come together well, and there was some. I mean, there were a couple games that were like interesting artistic projects. Like I wrote down the names of 1 or 2 of them that were like
those Polish video games.
Yeah, there are a couple Polish games that were very cool. There's some like post-apocalyptic ones that were kind of cool looking, but there were also a couple that were clearly designed to frustrate the user.
Yeah.
Like there was this one where like
Getting Over It, is that what it's called?
That's the one.
Yeah, you're in like a cauldron and you have a hammer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kids were raging out trying to play this, and I was wondering if they hadn't. It like literally there was a little display next to it describing how this game is designed to be impossible, and they were still doing it.
I can tell it's poorly conceived because you cannot. Obviously, this is somebody that's used to displaying visual media, and there is a way you're supposed to interact with a painting or something like that. You do not. Video games are one of the most effective art forms we have, but you don't actually experience the art form if you're not interacting with the mechanics of the game.
Yeah,
agreed.
That's right.
Just looking at it is not interacting with the game.
Yeah, that's why I kept saying inert. Like it just felt like. Yeah, I mean, I realized that like objects behind glass is a legitimate form of displaying something in a museum, but this was not that.
It did though make me realize I'm like, oh, this is kind of. I had these kind of sudden flashbacks, like spending an hour just extremely stoned on like mids in the early 2000s, like just staring at the Winamp visualization.
That's totally what I was thinking about
like,
also.
Yeah,
it was 100%.
Watching Wish You Were Here and the orb is like vibrating. I'm like, this is the future.
This is the only nostalgia content we will do on Ordinary Unhappiness.
I don't know about that.
2000s mids.
Yeah.
Winamp visualization. Not very good weed.
Hitting up your dealer on AIM.
That's right.
ICQ.
Yeah.
Right. Trying to pick the right away message just for yourself.
You still have that, and it's on Discord. Which is like the unconscious, I know no time or some shit like that.
Well, that's because that's my saying I don't respond to messages in any degree of
I know. I try to message you on Discord sometimes, and I'm like, oh, right. Like the unconscious, he knows no time.
That's right. Yes, I'm like Rome full of dinosaurs.
That's why we...
All right.
listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Danny Owl.
Welcome, folks. I am excited for what we're doing today, although I also feel a little trepidatious because I like to have notes in front of me. And today I have no notes. I have the text of a bunch of voicemails that we have been trying to get around to answering for the last while. So this is going to be our first non-Patreon mailbag episode, which means that I want to do a little bit of work first saying we aren't clinicians. We've done this before, but I feel like this is important to say is that we are not clinicians. We can respond to you as human beings, but we cannot give you any clinical psychological advice.
Yeah, we can't diagnose you. This is not medical advice. We're not offering financial advice either, except asking you to support the Patreon, which you should do for both mental health and financial health reasons. I'm saying that ironically. Again, that's not actual advice, but go ahead. Maybe it is.
It's undecidable.
It's undecidable. You can figure out how we feel on that. But actually, we are very grateful to the support of people who do that, and we're also very grateful to the people who call into the voicemail.
Yeah,
and we'll give that number later, but
we will.
Yeah,
Plus,
really
it's always in the show notes. I will also say that when we have done Patreon mailbag episodes, we have played the voicemails, but I have gotten some messages from folks being like, "I would like you to respond to this, but I also don't want you to play my voice on the air."
Fair.
So, because this episode isn't paywalled, we are going to default to reading messages. So if at some point you do, and we encourage you to do this, call in, just let us know whether it's cool to play your audio or not. We're very, very happy to respect those boundaries. We're all about boundaries here on Ordinary Unhappiness. But we're defaulting for today to my just reading the transcripts. So occasionally also, because Google Voice transcripts aren't perfect, if you are listening and you're like, this is my question and it is slightly differently worded, that is just an artifact of Google Voice transcriptions.
Yeah, and I just to say what we're going to do methodologically or what you're about to get yourself into, if you're listening to this, is instead of offering advice, though maybe we'll offer what I would do, and then we'll process it in some
advice as humans. There might be advice as humans,
and
as
certainly
humans.
Recommend things to read and we can speak to certain areas of our expertise. But honestly, what we're going to do is we're just going to free associate and kind of vibe on these things, and see what comes up. And I think that could be very interesting. It generally is kind of fun, but I also want to stipulate we're grateful to you for doing this, and we want to offer things that are helpful. And sometimes that may even translate into our asking questions back to you to reflect on, rather than our even answering the ones that you give us. So, yeah.
In nice analytic fashion, or for me, philosophical fashion. Are you all ready to get into it? Okay, cool. This first question is about psychic structure, and broadly about the extent to which it is important to understand, or I guess be able to name your own psychic structure. Okay, here it is.
Hi, I had a question about psychic structure and my own in analysis. I'm not a practitioner, but I am a patient of a few years. Obviously, my Lacanian analyst is never going to tell me you're a hysteric or you're a perverse subject. That obviously does not come up. But I have had people, when talking about symptoms, I have had people in the field say, oh, you're definitely a hysteric or things like that. And I never really know what to make of that or what to do with that information. But lately, I've understood oh yeah, that's my subject position. I read about perversion. I think oh, I must have that somewhere going on too. So my question is what is the relation? What is the overlap between perversion and hysteria? Is it important for me to understand my own psychic structure? I realize that it might change also going through analysis. And do I gain anything from having that knowledge? Isn't it an illusion to think that I can have that knowledge? And what do I do with that if I do have some sort of realization?
Yeah. So that is that call, which I feel like is, we're probably not going to be able to speak to every aspect of it, but I think for me, in some ways, the heart of it is this question of like, is it important for me to understand my own psychic structure, which I think is like a really wonderful question. And the caller also glossed it in terms of like subject position. So yeah, Patrick, you want to go on in on that?
Yeah, I think it's actually, I'm going to even rephrase like the question that you just asked as to like, what is the core question here? Because this is also going to require a little bit of disambiguation, right? Like psychic structure, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
This is a thing that, if you are, say, thinking about stuff in a Freudian perspective, you're familiar with, well, here are these psychic agencies, right? Or these structural features of the way this thing that is called the psyche is organized, like id, superego, ego, right? And that model is articulated differently at different points in Freud's career.
Sure. That's the second version.
Yeah.
Right.
But like part of the deal here is to sort of say like, you can't cut open someone's brain and be like, this is the ego, right? Even when someone is saying like, even when you have analysts or theoreticians describe, say, the ego as a bodily organ, that is a metaphor, right? These are not, psychic structures on that level are mutually interdependent artifacts or agencies of products of development and things like the way you change through therapy or have developed other relationships, et cetera. And they can only be understood relative to one another. And they only have utility insofar as they have explanatory power in dealing with what you could call your problems in living. Now, what this caller is also speaking about, and in this additional way, is psychic structures in the Lacanian context.
Yeah.
Right. And that's almost a little bit more complicated. Because, and just to quickly say this, when Lacan says that a person is a hysteric, right, or that a person is behaving in a mode that suggests that they're hysterical in orientation, right, that means something very different for him than it did for Freud.
Absolutely.
And it also means something very different from the other psychic structures I was talking about, which were about like internal psychic agencies. For Lacan, these psychic structures are ways of describing how a person relates to other people and to themselves through fantasy and through things like desire and anxieties, above all in relationship to dynamics of power and knowledge, right? And he has a whole bunch of these. They're different like discourses. They're different types of structures. Some of them, at different points in his thought, he labels it different things. But what I wanted to say, and if you want to pursue like the technical dimensions of this, I can recommend Danny Nobus has a Key Concepts in Lacanian Psychoanalysis and then a dictionary of these things.
Oh, and also, can I just jump in and say that Bruce Fink's, what is it, a clinical introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis is fantastic.
Yeah, it's quite good.
Yeah.
But also, too, I'm going to admit that a lot of my sympathies with Lacanians are people who are actually coming from traditions outside France, oftentimes, or working in French and otherwise. But I found this one volume that I came across, which is a very good one. It's in the Aronson's. It's the Lacanian Clinical Field series. The author is Juan.
We'll drop this in the show notes.
Yeah, it's Juan David Nazio, right? But I'm going to read two little quotes here. And what I want to the reason I'm doing this is because if you are familiar with like classical hysteria, right? The people feigning on Freud's feigning couch, or the people who have conversions disorders, right? Like we talked about, a hysteric is a person who has a series of physical symptoms.
Yeah.
Right.
That don't have that seemingly have no organic cause.
Right. That's not what this is.
No.
Well, of course, it could be used to explain that. Let me just, this is how Dave.
Please.
Yeah, this is how he does this.
We love a good excerpt.
And note here, this is a Lacanian account that's going to be like, this is what hysteria is, and speak to it in a sort of authoritative way. And it's useful, but the point I'm trying to get at here too is that these things are not like organs or like a gene code. They have a different kind of what you could say ontological status, or rather they exist because of their descriptive power and efficacy, which is where I want us to go and where I think Abby was already opening sort of the conversation into. So here's what Juan David Nazio says. For psychoanalysis, hysteria is not, as is usually believed, an illness affecting an individual, but rather the unhealthy state of a human relationship that subjects one person to another. Hysteria is, above all, the name we give to the tie and to the bonds that the neurotic weaves in his relation with others through his fantasies. Fear and the persistent refusal to experience pleasure are at the center of the psychic life of the hysterical neurotic. And in order to remove this threat of an accursed and dreaded pleasure, the hysteric unconsciously invents a fantasy scenario designed to prove to himself and to the world that there is no pleasure except the kind that is unfulfilled. Right? Now, that's, I think, a very astute description of what the hysterical structure is relationally and in terms of internal experience from a Lacanian perspective. But note, that is not a conversion disorder. That's also not the opinion of what all psychoanalysts have to say.
Of course.
And even more than that, too, it describes dynamics that almost, in common language, we might say, wow, a person whose entire life is oriented around not experiencing pleasure, that sounds pretty perverse, right? In common language. But actually, no, perversion is yet another complicated structural term.
Yeah.
In the Lacanian perspective. Where I'm going with all this, and I'll throw it back to you guys,
sure,
is there is a way in which these terms or such terms are, yes, they're jargon, but they're terms of art, right? And they're terms of explaining things, and they have, in other words, heuristic value.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I was going to go. Yeah.
And in a minute, maybe we can even talk about, and where I want to talk about this too with you all, is on some level, I think the stakes of trying to understand what am I really in terms of structural stuff like this, and in terms of the fairly Baroque designs of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is kind of similar to people being like, well, what is my real diagnosis?
Yeah.
Right? What do I actually have? What am I? And I think we can, rather, we're not clinicians, we can't diagnose that. We can instead ask, well, what's driving us to that? What do we want from that? And aren't those sort of heuristics too? Because so many of them are basically just healthcare billing codes too. So yeah, right. To you, Abby, please.
What I want to say, Patrick, is I think this is not simply a question. And I'm not now speaking to the caller's intention, but rather to sort of what I see as the heart of what is behind that question. Is it important to know my own psychic structure? That's not just a diagnostic question. And I think this is sort of what you were getting at, is it's an existential question. And what we're talking about, whether we're talking about billing codes or whether we're talking about the DSM or whether we're talking about the PDM, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, is something like, how do I and more to the point, how do others name some part of this thing that I am? And does that naming give me relief? Right. That's to me is the question, does that naming give me relief? Or, Patrick, you were using the language of explanatory power. And so we're getting into this, we're talking about from the perspective of the patient, right? We're not talking about the perspective of the clinician, not only because we literally cannot speak to that, but because that's not what the question is. And so I think something that's interesting to me is also, I don't think that the caller is asking about the ontological, what am I a hysteric? Does that inhere in me? Is there a perverse structure? You know what I mean? It's not an ontological question. It is, as you said, these are heuristic categories. And have I found a theoretical language that I feel does me justice? I know I'm sort of mixing my metaphors in terms of talking about both relief and justice. Those belong to different languages, different idioms. But what came up for me is two things. One is about categories that I think are bullshit, but that nonetheless provide relief or that provide some sort of sense of like, okay, I feel named by this in a way that allows me to do something more or differently or think more or differently about myself. So like, let me get into something that I think we can all agree is bullshit, which is the Myers-Briggs. Despite the fact that this like comes from Jung, that like, it has a sort of checkered history, and it, along with like stuff like, what is it? Like Clifton's Strengths Finder and, Enneagrams and all those things. Like all these things are like functional, like they're basically nonsense, right? But they provide enormous amounts of meaning. Like even I'm like, I think I still find I find the language of like introversion to be very helpful. Does it matter that's whether that's like a thing that inheres in the world or in people? No, but it's really useful for me to say to my husband, hey, I've been talking to people all day and I need to go and be away because I'm not energized. I'm tired from this. Whereas like you're buzzing off of it. Do you know what I mean? Like that's language that helps us communicate, even though its origins are, or at least if I was like, excuse me, Patrick, I'm an INTP. So like we really need to right now, like not talk for the next 5 hours after I've just taught 2 classes. Even if that's nonsense, it still has like a communicative and explicative function. But now we're kind of in the realm of self-diagnosis also, which gets us into like, TikTok teens all telling themselves that they have these sorts of things. Whereas I think the caller was saying like, does it matter in some way whether my analyst communicates this to me? Yeah. That is a different kind of thing. And I think it's much more powerful, right? Yeah. And something that in some ways, again, I think a lot of people get a lot of relief from saying like, okay, like I have generalized anxiety disorder. And that's language that I can use to explain myself to myself. It's language I can use to explain myself to others. Other people can recognize this. There can be a whole chain of recognitions. But the flip side of this is also, what if you feel misnamed or misrecognized by this sort of diagnosis?
Yeah, and I think in some ways, like even as I just to put my cards on the table here, like you've probably picked up on the fact that I have a certain skepticism vis-a-vis the utility of certain types of analytic abstractions in terms of how much rapport they can have with lived experiences of suffering. Yeah. However, that may come down to a matter of taste and individual people and pairing, right? Like I think it's, I don't want to do a caricatured here thing, but like there are distinctive national traditions of psychoanalysis that come from certain places and emerge in certain times. And, I see Lacanian, a lot of like classical Lacanian psychoanalysis working very well for many of the same people who are, like thinking about existentialism and like they're smoking galwazes and like they're capable of like, life ways that
I thought you weren't going to do a caricature.
No, well, but I'm getting to say, like, I'm thinking about people who are like, you're at the do my go and you're also having an affair, et cetera. I'm being goofy about this, but I'm also saying like that may be a theoretical vocabulary that talks about structures, that talks about loss, that talks about how desire is fleeting, and that makes you think about yourself in relation to these things. And even where you can use a term like hysteric to think about yourself without being like, oh, I am histrionic.
Right.
That may be a thing that for people of a cultural disposition, but also with certain tastes, that can be very helpful. By the same token, it may be helpful for many Americans, right, who would rather understand themselves or come to understand themselves by talking about things like, oh, I don't know, codependence or like love languages or et cetera. Do you follow me? This is...
I do.
And I'm not knocking, and please hear me, I'm not knocking any of these. I think it really is a different strokes for different folks thing. But that the core point is, and I'll come back to the Lacanian dimension of this too, because in some ways I think that what the caller gives us by talking about using this Lacanian terminology, which really is all about like, how do we relate to the other's knowledge and to our fantasies about what the other knows is actually very helpful and useful. But I do think like the question is like, if you come to understand yourself in a new way because of a therapeutic encounter, and that produces change in your life it changes how you relate to yourself. It changes how you relate to your relationships, or at least it gives you new perspective and a certain type of heightened awareness or changed awareness and that maybe empowers you or gives you new senses of agency, then that it seems like a good reason to be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I can think here too about why I'm very big into recommending books for people, because I believe very strongly in like bibliotherapy stuff, right? Like, and I
say a little bit of what you mean by bibliotherapy, please.
So I think about this is a thing that actually does work for some people, which is that you read books to learn more about your condition, right, or what you think to be a condition at a given time, but also that allows you to connect with other people having these experiences, right? I think maybe is that the line in Baldwin where like he discovered going to a library and learning that he wasn't the first person to have felt certain types of pangs of like
you think you're the only one.
You think you're the only one, and you're not.
And then you read,
And I'll, without giving TMI, right? I will say that like there have been periods in my life where, like, I can think about like a time in college where I just was not well and had deep experiences of just anhedonia and lassitude, and I couldn't move, and I was experiencing all this and thinking about all this in many ways that were not psychoanalytic, but that were couched in a sort of Catholic self-punitive rhetoric and feeling like I wasn't helpful or anything, right? And at some point, a therapist did say like you were experiencing a major depressive episode, right? And I think maybe she said you're depressive, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. And which takes it into the sort of identitarian realm.
Yeah, like you have this thing, you are this thing, et cetera. And I mean, later, I to the extent to which I can speak to other experiences of psychotherapy and my own experiences of life, like I don't think that's like the core thing that I've got going on. I think that happens for other reasons. But the point here, because this is not about me, is that what that led me to do was, well, to go check out Andrew Solomon's amazing book on depression, The Noonday Demon,
wonderful.
Which is a beautiful book. And I spent a week in bed, because I was in bed anyways, reading about the history of depression, other people's experiences of depression, and this author's own experience of depression.
Yeah.
And it didn't cure me, but I suddenly felt, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
To maybe I can think about therapy or even medication right now, because earlier I was being like, well, this is just weakness, or this is just me. Like, well, it would be better if I just disappeared. I must be a burden on my friends. Like I was going really dark places. But the point there is that I was able to establish a relationship to this diagnostic category, to this fairly abstract set of syllables, and to, yes, a healthcare billing code.
Yeah.
But that was part of a process of me working through certain problems that I was having at the time, and that helped and deepened my life going forward. Even though I've now later, gone on to other sort of understandings of what's going on with me. So to that extent, I want to tell the reader, or the caller rather, to be a reader, right? And to sort of to read the Nasio book, to
read the Think book too.
Read the Think book, but also I would encourage them to not just because I do think I'm sensitive to what's at stake in the Lacanian dynamic specifically, and to some stuff that happened in this call, right? Where it's like, maybe try looking for some other theoretical vocabularies that talk about themes of relating to knowledge, right? About maybe anxiety, or the search for a certain type of identity, et cetera. And to see if those give you some additional perspective on this stuff, because it does. I don't think it would be helpful to pin down your psychoanalyst and be like, what do you think I really am?
Yeah. Right? I agree, because no matter what, that is going to be such an first of all, they're not going to tell you.
Yeah.
Second of all, they're not going to tell you. Yeah. Third of all, if they did tell you, which they shouldn't, probably, I don't know your relationship with your analyst, but it would be so overdetermined. It would be such a weight to get out from under.
Yeah.
I think it would have the weight of inevitability. This is part of what I like about Lacanian analysis, is the sort of occasional oracular utterance, but then what comes with that is that it is so weighty.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes those things are a weight that you can really struggle to get out from under. And can I say one other thing?
Yeah, please. And then
before I forget is about what you were talking about in college and having this episode of major depressive disorder, and in some way finding new language that was not Catholic language. Is that for you, what happened was this new language was in some ways, even though it can be laden, liberatory insofar as it decoupled things from a moralizing discourse. And I think we are not in the same kind of cultural moment as when you were in college. The shifts around like the destigmatization of mental health issues is real, but certainly not complete. So I don't think there is any way to still not give even, again, a psychoanalytic category, which generally speaking, at least coming out of the Freudian tradition, Freud is famously like not making ethical judgments about his patients, whether by diagnoses or otherwise. There's a real openness to that. I still think that I've been thinking a lot. We're really being free associative today. I'm kind of leaning into it. So I'm thinking a lot. I teach almost every year I teach Intro to Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. And one of the things that I'm doing there is introducing a set of theoretical concepts about gender and sexuality and identity. And these things are really fraught, right? But often I have in my class, I see folks and hear them expressing things about like being able to see like the way that Sarah Ahmed explains heteronormativity unlocks something. I was able to give a name to this thing that I felt that was like inchoate or inarticulate. And now I can name it to myself and I can name it to others who might be skeptical of me. And that's powerful. That's super, super powerful. But I guess what we are now skirting is this sort of borderlands between diagnostic categories and identitarian categories. And I think, and this is the reason I started thinking about my students, is like a thing that I often say to them is like, there is no text that can bear the weight of your expectations.
Yes.
And just like I think here, there is no diagnostic category, whether it is, a billing code so that, your insurance is paying for the bulk of your session, or whether it is a Lacanian diagnostic category that can bear the weight of what you might want from it, and certainly cannot provide the totality of the explanatory ground for who you are and how you behave.
I think that's really clarifying, and I think we're even sort of saying the same thing in different ways. I think, which is like what we're trying to emphasize is use value and clarity,
cash value.
Yeah, not cash. Well, particularly in a situation where we're paying someone else. Yeah, but I do think
you can take that out.
No, it's fine.
Sorry.
People like the cash value stuff, but like I will
I'm
say, like
you.
imagine a situation. I know. Imagine a situation like where, and I'll think of some of the best encounters I've ever had with clinicians, right? Where they'll be like, look, you're going to see this billing code, and that's if you have a DSM at home, you're going to see. I'm saying that you have, XYZ. But I don't think you are that. And I don't even know if that's what you quote unquote have. Yeah. I just know you're having XYZ problems in living.
Right.
And we need to keep seeing one another, and I need to keep giving you medication. Right. So it's like, oh, look, buddy, you came here because you were having panic attacks, and I'm going to code you as having generalized anxiety disorder. But I think that at root of this, maybe some childhood traumas, which we can explore over time. But the emphasis there is on the exploration.
Yeah.
And in order to sustain it, we have to use these terms.
Yes.
But don't think that you're reduced to that. And I think
that's important.
So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say here is the key point or the utility of these things are, and I hear this sort of in the background of the expectation of like, well, if I could only know what the analyst knows, if I could only see what the analyst saw. I think that in some ways that's similar to the like, if I only could get a diagnostic term that would capture me in some way. And the thing is like, well, I mean, and this is also why I'm encouraging people to read multiple things, right? There is a tradition in psychoanalysis, for example, that I'm thinking here, I think it's Harry Cron, his book Hysteria, The Elusive Neurosis, I think it is. There's a good talk of that, and you can find online, where like
we'll put it in the show notes.
You find contemporary psychoanalysts being like, look, yes, classical hysteria has gone away, and then they structuralize hysteria in a slightly different way. They're like, hysteria is for them a type of way of relating to questions of identity, but also above all to agency and your own personal sense of agency and the power of others.
Yeah.
And that involves this kind of contortions of disavowing your own efficacy while also sort of being there and being like, I'm here, right? And so like the example that he gives, right, of an example of a type of modern hysteria, right? Because again, this is not conversion disorder. This is hysteria as a metaphor, and all these things probably ultimately function metaphorically. Is people who are like, so again, I'm not co-signing this. I'm paraphrasing it, but like the person who says, "Oh yeah, I didn't show up that day. That wasn't me. That was my ADD. I'm sorry, I missed that. That was my ADD." Or someone who's like, "Well, I yelled at you, but that's just my brain chemistry," right? And what Cron does, and note, these are different diagnostic categories. Yeah. And of course, those are, thinking about brain chemistry could be a metaphor that would be very helpful. Being diagnosed as ADD could be life-changing for many people. But what Cron is pointing to there, and which I think is useful for us, is the way in which the invocation of one of those terms comes to stand in, basically reflects a relation or a structure of, well, I'm passive to certain elements in me, or I am at this mercy of something that's in me, but that I don't have any control over. And the through line here is that, and here I'm reading into this, but I think it's helpful for our purposes.
Go for it.
Is that these are examples of a person kind of, people have to do what they have to do, right? But there's a missed opportunity there. And I'm not just talking about like not taking responsibility for stuff, because like, if you have ADD, you still have to apologize if you screw something up and you offend someone. But I said that's my experience. But that rather there's the trap of certain types of relating to diagnostic categories, or the trap to relating to the knowledge of authority of the analyst, can sort of freeze you into a position where you are no longer going on in that process of exploration.
Yeah.
Right. And you get stuck. And so what I guess I'm trying to say is the hope that a given term, or finding a given term for yourself in this diagnostic mode, or in terms of like the almost mystical knowledge that the analyst supposedly has, that is a hope that you should interrogate, because oftentimes, if you actually achieve that, and let alone, like, I don't know, you see the doodles that your analyst is also drawing on the paper, like it could be brutal, it could be heartbreaking, but it can leave you, it can allow you to defer what could be much more interesting, which is namely an ongoing exploration of what's going on with you and trying to take in new terms to look at it. And to sort of put a bow on this before I hand it entirely back to you, like what I'm thinking about it is that like, we have a certain type of faith that simply being able to name a thing, or to use a name to create a thing, or to see a thing by invoking a name, that we then change the circumstances of suffering that are central to the thing, right? And I think that any good psychoanalytic psychotherapy and any solid approach to heuristics of these terms, whether diagnostic or structural or what have you, and this could be any school of psychoanalysis, should disabuse you, or should leave you unsatisfied in the fantasy that simply having a name for a thing will heal the thing, or fix the thing, or in any event undo the suffering. The best I think you can get is using terms, heuristics, having encounters that change the way that you relate to that suffering, that maybe give you the tools to change that suffering, or that in any event make that suffering more interesting.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the core.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm going to say one other thing before we move on to the next question, which is I also think, a kind of theme that has emerged from us, like, I feel like we're like picking this up and like this call up and like examining it from all angles in a way that has certainly been very interesting for me. But one of the themes that has emerged has been something like, okay, to name a thing can be powerful, but it can also be reductive, and it can be a trap in some ways. And it can also be a trap insofar as it can lead you to think about psychic structure in a vacuum, as opposed to in terms of like material conditions. And that's That's one thing that I think is important, is that not only that diagnoses and theories in general like emerge out of particular times and are, caused and conditioned and made possible by those times, but also that like you are a person in the world, right? You might feel anxious all the time, and there might be really good reality-based reasons for that would not that are not necessarily part of like your, like, you can't see me, I'm doing air quotes, like character, right? They're not like part of characterological structure. They're a reality-based response to, say, like conditions of precarity.
Somebody hanging off the edge of a cliff isn't thinking about how, wow, I'm really scared. It must be childhood trauma bowling up right now.
Yeah.
And we should say that this is one of the critiques of an entire history of several traditions of psychoanalysis. And here I'm thinking about ego psychology, which gets a bad rap, is that it gets a bad rap, but also there's a grain of truth in this. It's another conversation to have and has a lot to do with the history of the 20th century. But people would be coming to psychoanalysts being like, I'm having problems in work, I'm having issues with my spouse, I feel like my life is meaningless, etc. And instead, the analyst would not, or like, I was just in a car accident 2 days ago, right? Then the analyst would instead be like, let's go back to your childhood. Let's talk about these classic, and you can see there how and I really appreciate what you just said, Dan, too, because it shifts the focus in a way that allows us to move on, too, is that there's a temptation on the part of the analyst sometime to put too much stock into theoretical models or into terminological sort of naming, right? And that can, as in this example, produce a situation where an analyst would rather talk about primal scenes and like screen memories for ancient traumas rather than help you with a trauma that's right in front of you.
Yeah.
Right. And so this stuff coats both the attachment to terms here and that both their possibilities, but also the ways that they can be traps, cuts both ways.
It does. And I promise we will move on now, but I just want to say that like there is a question here to me that is also like, what are the uses of theory? Like that's a great question that we are certainly not going to be able to answer today, but I hope that we have gestured at some, like sketched out some thoughts in response to that too.
So like in a nutshell, if the listener called in a voicemail asking about, they were pretty much saying like, what I read into it was like, is the goal of this therapy to come away with words that I can use to describe myself, to like set expectations. And you guys are saying the words aren't a goal, the words are a function.
You just reminded me of something really key here that comes up in the Lacanian context too. There's a distinction between what you might call like full speech and empty speech, right? Like, does the term hit the real, you might say, or like, does it do something? Does it produce movement?
Yeah.
Or, as with so many words, does it just get put into the signifying chain and the production of language? Right. Like does
it actually produce psychic change?
Right.
Yeah. Imagine, and now I'm attacking myself here, but imagine, I don't know, you get a diagnosis or something. You're like, okay, that's got to be what I am. Thanks so much, doctor. I don't need to see you anymore. And then you buy a dozen books about that thing and you never read them. Right. You could see how
you always read them.
I eventually do, but also
okay, I read them.
I'm exactly, well, and then that's, God bless you for it. But this is an example of like, again, that
rings true.
The word could be correct, but the issue isn't the word itself. It's how it's delivered and how you relate to it.
Yeah.
And does it become something more than just a signifier, or does it have something more potent in terms of how it structures how you relate to yourself in your life?
Like this caller said that they've been in therapy for years with this person. Yes. Could you imagine if you were to go back in time and imagine them, quote unquote, diagnosing you 3 months into therapy?
Yeah.
And then you think back 2 years later, how ridiculous would that 3-month diagnostic actually have been? How much would you have evolved since then?
Yeah, but also, like, that diagnosis could have been entirely right. This is something Freud says very early on, right? If you diagnose someone, or if you tell someone what they are and what their problem must be very early on, they may just intellectualize it away.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is like one of a very interesting moment in Freud, that it's like, I'm trying to think of where I think he says this in the Studies on Hysteria, but like, don't quote me on that. Where he's just like, yeah, you can tell them But that does not, I mean, this is why we get like, remembering, repeating, and working through. Like I could hand you on a platter. I personally can't hand you on a platter. Like, here is what's going on with you. But that doesn't, you're not like, okay, great. Like, I'm cured. I intellectually know what's going on with me. And so now I can behave differently. But yeah, I mean, this is why I'm always going on about how like psychoanalysis is so interesting, because it is never just intellectual and is also never just emotional.
Yes.
But you cannot simply hand somebody some words about like who they are and say and expect psychic transformation. And in fact, quite the opposite can be the case.
That was an awesome last question, by the way.
That was a great last question.
That was great, yeah.
I loved it. Thank you, caller, for sending us that question. Okay, next one.
I'm a biologist, also in analysis, and I was curious if you had any insights about the evolutionary basis of concepts such as the unconscious. From what I know of evolutionary psychology, that's pretty much entirely bullshit and doesn't really concern stuff with psychoanalytic concepts anyway. But yeah, I'm just curious, like why even I've evolved this psychic structure.
There's more to that question, but I think I'm just going to cut it off there.
Yeah, I'm going to field this one because I spent a couple days after getting it reviewing the actually kind of substantial amount of coursework I did in philosophical neuroscience, and like also looking over some stuff that was really hot back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, in what was at the time called like neuropsychoanalysis stuff. So I'm going to offer some stuff, but maybe also come up short. So I think we need to disambiguate a bunch of things about this thing called the unconscious. And I realize, in fact, that some of this may be my fault, because in one of the first episodes that we did talking about what the unconscious is, using the uncanny, I kind of referred to a whole bunch of different stuff as like happening in the unconscious. And that included things that, a more cognitively inclined person might talk about as like automaticity, right? Like unconscious actions that are arising because of, say, like deeply coded and perhaps even like genetically marked things, like, I don't know, the fear of snakes, right? Or the impulse to, what's the term from the psychology of religion? Like postulate agency for non-existent entities, right? Something is moving in the bushes. This is why horror movies are scary, right? You hear something in the bushes, you think actually it's a person. Like you lock up the house, something happens in the basement, you're like, oh, it's a person, right? Or as that old Wallace Stevens poem goes, right? If it's a panther, don't answer, right? It's your brain telling you. And you can see, like, you can imagine what the imagined evolutionary environment that would produce. And here, I guess I'm going to use like Jerry Fodor's terminology for this. Forgive me for people who are not interested in this stuff, but I kind of enjoy a lot of it. This is like, you could see how like little modules of unconscious dispositions, tics, behaviors, whatever, could have fairly plausible evolutionary beginnings, right? You could, if someone's making noises, if there are noises, you probably don't want to go like, check it out, right? We have some unconscious impulses, and a lot of the things that happen in our bodies also happen entirely unconsciously, right? The unconscious that's at stake in the Freudian sense, but also in the broader psychoanalytic sense, though, is something a little different, because it's very much a thing that can only be understood from the position of a socialized, or however quote unquote barbaric or civilized that society may be, but a socialized human group, right? And I actually would like, in a future episode, maybe we could do some stuff on like the history of the unconscious.
Sure.
Because it's worth saying, Freud did not like invent the unconscious. If anything, you can draw on the work of figures like Richard Ellman, who has a book called The Discovery of the Unconscious, and also did some comparative ethnopsychiatry on this stuff, where basically you can go to things like Greek myths, to the ideas of oracles, but also to even like romantic poetry, or a whole bunch of like weird occult movements and seances and past life stuff. But in any event, people are using words, not the Greeks, but words that are translated as unconscious, or by the time of the 17th century, in English, the people are talking about things being unconscious. And oftentimes this is a composite thing that is related to everything from, awareness of ghosts to artistic creativity to the weird prophetic character of dreams, etc. Right? So when Freud proposes what is specifically important for our purposes, namely a dynamic unconscious, that is, from an intellectual history perspective, actually bringing together a whole bunch of different things, right? So to put this in slightly different words, we are people who have to deal with the unconscious, and we hypostasize that unconscious as a unitary thing. And psychoanalysis certainly like asks us to explore it. But in terms of like a possible evolutionary or biological account for why we have this, that could be that, again, it's a composite artifact. It has everything to do from those little modules to also our acculturated experiences, and bears upon things like, I don't know, like the biology of why we need to sleep. And I should say, for people who are interested in exploring this and like reading people who are science doctors and MD, PhD psychoanalysts, I was looking at some stuff like there's Karnak put together a bunch of books in what was called the cognitive neurosciences and psychoanalysis. There's some stuff by Visa Talvitier called Freudian Unconscious and Cognitive Neuroscience. There's a book by Fred Levin called Emotion and the Psychodynamics of the Cerebellum, right? So to the extent to which like there is a temptation to understand whatever the unconscious is by reference to unconscious neural brain processes, there is literature on this.
So there's a whole field of neuropsychoanalysis.
And
Siri Hustvedt has also done some interesting stuff in that realm.
And it's also present in the work of Mark Solms, right, who is prolific in that field, and I think has a lot of stuff on YouTube too. So we can, I think, so let's just stipulate that this unconscious means different things, different people, different disciplinary perspectives are going to try and understand it. I will also say, though, too, that there is some interesting crossover work in terms of Freud's later anthropology and primatology and ethnography, right?
Really?
Yes.
I don't know about this.
Oh, this is Bobby Paul's stuff.
Educate me.
I really want to have Bobby on. Robert Paul, brilliant psychoanalyst and training analyst and also an anthropologist, has a book called Our Two-Track Minds, Rehabilitating Freud on Culture, right? And there he's, among other things, reads like the story of the primal horde.
Like from Totem and Taboo.
From Totem and Taboo. And he's like, what if this is more than just a fable? What if this actually does speak to certain dynamics that happen in primate like groups? Because the horde is actually a troop. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And it actually becomes an argument that you could tie into Marxist feminists' accounts of social reproduction in the longue durée, a la Engels, right? So this is also, again, a direction that we could go. But suffice it to say that some of the things that when Freud is talking about like some of the weirdness that happens in like some of his like talks about like deep history, et cetera, that this is actually, I think, someone with a biological background or a primatological or anthropological background could actually put to do some work to see like there's a there in terms of thinking about psychoanalysis or like the emergence of the unconscious in that context. But all that said, I think what's most important for our purposes now, and that might be most interesting for the caller, is Freud's fascination with, and this is kind of very meta of me, and forgive me if it's a little abstract, Freud is really interested in situations where something comes into being for overdetermined reasons, right? It's plural in its causality. It's not a monocausal thing, but that produces these things come together to produce something of a degree of complexity that is of a different order and more than just the sum of its parts, right? This is what's at stake in some of the conversations you'll do about it later about like the death drive, et cetera. But what I kind of want us to point to is that so for the key thing for the Freudian perspective is when you have a human mind, right, or the human person with a psyche or whatever it is you want to call it, that sensorium / space of cogitation, whatever, is the output of a whole series of constitutive processes, but that the fact that it is basically, and now I'm thinking actually like Evan Thompson's terminology, it is an emergent, dynamic, autopoietic system that has hard limits on what it can think about in terms of what came prior to it.
So you're saying that the question from the listener is, I'm going to paraphrase here, like, is the unconscious, or how much of the unconscious is like evolutionarily informed? So like how much of it is tied to biology? And it sounds like you're saying,
why would we have evolved this thing
right,
called the unconscious? And can we even use the languages of the life sciences to talk about it in a meaningful way?
And it sounds like you're saying that if we were to use the languages of the life science to describe the unconscious, we would be unscribing some form of its structure, but we would not get close to describing the reality of the experienced unconscious.
Yes, and the totality of what it means and why it works as a site of intervention or of like psychic change in our lives and in therapy.
Which kind of connects to the first question.
Yes,
in
precisely.
some ways, right?
Right.
When you're talking about like psychic dynamism.
Yeah. So like we could be like, okay, why do we have weird dreams?
Yeah.
Right? Why do we dream at all?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then you might
you might say to keep us asleep.
You might say, well, that would be the Freudian answer.
Yeah.
You get a biological answer that would be mechanistic. That would be like, well, your body has to process certain things or like go into certain types of like modes. Also, your brain needs to rest. And by rest, we mean you have to transfer short-term memory into longer-term memory, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So like there you have, and then maybe we could be like, well, you obviously need to have rest and to digest because otherwise you will be eaten by panthers, right?
Isn't this question, why do you have to sleep rather than why do you have such complex dreams?
Precisely.
Yeah.
So like we by using a biological framework and an evolutionary one, we could produce a story that's more than just like a just so story for why why a great deal of our life is spent unconscious. And we maybe have accurately described the exigencies that came together to produce this. And Freud would be very happy with this because Freud saw himself as a Darwinian and always saw himself as invested in this. Yeah. But we haven't answered the question of why are our dreams so goddamn weird? And why do we remember them and get hung up on them during the day? And why do they haunt us in random moments during the day when stuff that like echoes that dream appears, right? Well, in other words, the register of meaning and lived experience is a bigger unconscious.
That's where I was going, is sort of like what is the evolutionary answer to why are we infinitely complex?
Yes. Yeah. Right. And so that's what I was trying, when I use this language of like, and again, I was thinking about, I think it's Evan Thompson's line at Mind and Life is the book I'm thinking of now, but like this idea that if you get enough complicated things working together, look, like the mitochondria, the famous powerhouse of the cell, was at one point its own little thing, and then it came together with a whole bunch of other things, and they formed a germ layer around themselves, and now we have more complicated organisms, right? And the idea on each of these levels, or rather the idea that I'm trying to gesture out with these examples, in which Freud is full of talk of like pseudopods and little organelles and all this shit, is that you can have things that emerge from a whole lot of little things, but that are on another order of complexity than all the other things that made them together. Mm-hmm. And that moreover...
But literally like more than the sum of their parts.
More than the sum of their parts, capable of doing more. It's putting to have multiple use, multiple function, et cetera. But also one feature of that like causal overdetermination is that it's very difficult to think backwards from the position of that more sophisticated thing to arrive at monocausal accounts of how you got there. Right?
So you're going towards overdetermination.
I'm going towards overdetermination, but I'm also going towards this a recurrent theme in Freud, right? Which is like one thing that the problem of the unconscious is, you could say, a problem of the fact that we live in civilization, mm-hmm. right? And that we live in modernity.
Yeah.
And that we have all sorts of social and meaning-saturated interactions with one another that impose limits on what otherwise we might describe as very narrowly Darwinian urges to reproduce or whatever.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And so the unconscious, such as it is not just like where the drives live right? It's not just where those Darwinian components sort of push and pull, but it's also where we as conscious people struggle to understand this half of ourself, or this more than half of ourself.
Yeah. It's part of ourselves.
Yeah. And that the way we cross that sort of boundary is always imperfect, but it's also all about meaning. Right. And I think that this is another way of saying that a lot of the Freudian project we can understand as being about, well, very specifically, the problems of the friction between more elemental drive-based stuff, right? Stuff that corresponds more easily to evolutionary biological explanations, and the fact that we are also more than just the sum of those things. And there's a friction between
that we are meaning-making beings.
We're meaning-making beings, right? And that, like, another way of saying this, and this is basically Freud's like idea of like where self-consciousness comes into being, right? This is one of Freud's later thoughts. He kind of gets a little Kojève or Hegelian about this, if you want to talk about it. It's like, well, basically, a creature that becomes sophisticated enough to like have consciousness is also immediately going to have the experience of pain and suffering and be like, I wish I wasn't conscious.
Right. Sure.
So
life is too much for us.
Life is too much for us.
That's what Freud says in Civilization and Its Discontents.
And I think it's that.
And I say to you, at least 3 to 4 times a week.
Yeah, I have yet to fully metabolize. But yeah, like the idea here is that like biologically we can talk about pain, psychoanalytically and politically we talk about suffering, right?
Yeah,
and
that's useful.
And the
speaking of useful heuristic distinctions,
and so suffering is about the meaning or either the meaningful, how we make meaningful, or how we grapple with the meaninglessness of pain. And
great.
I hope that's helpful to the biologists out there. And I haven't done too much violence. I'd love to have, if people, we have some lists of people who we'd like to invite, but I'm very eager for us to talk more about psychoanalysis and anthropology. And I'd love to talk with people who are doing serious contemporary work in psychoanalytic neurosciences. I think that would be really cool. So if you have recommendations, or if you yourself are listening to this, and it's you, please drop us a note.
Mark Soames, call us.
Here is a message from another listener.
Hello, I live in Toronto, where we're seeing growing rates of public violence by severely mentally ill people, especially since the pandemic. Homeless encampments are a going issue here, and the only responses we seem to see are either to tear them down or just leave them to their own. Is there any possibility of responding to the emergency of the exploding mental health crisis in this neoliberal institutionalized society?
I'm just going to say something that's not very psychoanalytic.
Yeah.
But I know Toronto, like a lot of major North American cities, has a good deal of unoccupied investment properties. And that Airbnb is a big part of the scene there as well. And it seems to me just simply straightforward that if people are unhoused, a thing that should happen, and that one doesn't need to be a mental health professional at all, is that those properties, which exist for basically rentier purposes, should be seized and made available to people who are otherwise on the street and desperate. Like I want to, like, I'm not making the question. I'm just like saying that.
Cosign.
Like, yeah. Like actual like political engagement on this one, like giving people homes.
Yeah.
That's what they need.
Yeah.
And I think the idea, there's a kind of fucked up thing that happens. I'm not putting this on the caller, but like where people are like, oh, look at these people acting out and how terrible they're being, right? Their suffering, their distress, their decompensation is taken as singularly their responsibility and something that was probably going to be inevitable.
Yeah.
But what is entirely erased from that is the violence of the foreclosure of opportunities and the brutalization by state systems that have left them in that position where that type of outcome is entirely almost inevitable.
Yeah.
I also should say here,
this is why before in that first, responding to that first call, we were saying like, we can't just talk about diagnostic categories. We also have to talk about economic and social conditions.
Yeah. And that means doing, like, I think there is a psychoanalytic insight here that's helpful for us, right? Which is that when someone does something violent And when someone who is marginalized or vulnerable or has otherwise been othered by the hegemonic social order.
The socius.
Yeah, the socius. The temptation is to see what they're doing as a true expression of who they are, right? It becomes we commit what's called the fundamental attribution error. Like, this person was always quote unquote crazy, or this person was so violent. What is effaced from that is the whole sequence of events, the failures by institutions, the tragedies of lack of care, the brutalization of basically encountering the police who function as social workers in our modern social order, right?
That's kind of where I was actually going, is thinking about like Eric Adams's New York and the sort of like the answer to every problem is there is more police on every subway platform.
And it's why the cops basically can while they're beating the shit out of someone, can yell, "Stop resisting." And everyone around there will, even if they're videotaping it, the majority of people at one of those scenes will think, oh, actually that person started it and they were resisting, even if they're not. Later, the justification for why the person was being beaten was because they were either an imminent threat of violence or they started the violence, right? So in other words, causality can be entirely reversed.
Yeah.
And a person can be blamed for our having had to punish them. Which is a really contorted way of thinking about causality and identification with the aggressor, but I think directly bears on this. I'll also say, just as a data point here, and for some stuff, a book that may be interesting to people, I want to call attention to the work of anthropologist and ethnographer Tanya Luhrmann.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
She's done a bunch of things, including a really good ethnography of American psychiatry. Mm-hmm. But in more recent years, what her work is focused on is cross-cultural studies of schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And it's been some years since I've read this, so I may get a detail or two wrong here, right? But schizophrenia is one of those disorders that is, another one of her books calls it our most troubling madness, right? It raises lots of questions about the genetic versus the social and all these other developmental factors, right? But it is one of those things that, more so than a lot of other things, you can point to as existing in fairly recognizable forms in terms of like symptom clusters across different cultures, right? But what she does in her work, and this is, I think, really, really interesting, and may also bear too on the previous question in terms of like, what is this thing called the unconscious and how is it different, right? Like from, I don't know, like other spandrels or artifacts of evolutionary processes, like having a tailbone or something. She compares, the 3 sites that she studies are, I believe, in India, in somewhere in, I think, Western Africa, and then in North America, and I believe it may even be Toronto, I think. But the point here is that she finds something remarkable, which is that, one, these are different societies that treat people who are exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia very differently, right? In some of these, what you call as like rural or traditional communities, a person who is, say, having hallucinations or is behaving in ways that we might find erratic, et cetera, is treated as perhaps as being sort of touched by local gods, or a person who can see things that aren't there and can commune with the spirit realm, and thus they're invited to weddings, right, as a sort of like both as like a sort of boon in their own right, but also as acts of charity, right? They are seen as engaging in some type of play, right? They're, in other words, not seen as a threat.
And not pathologized.
They're not pathologized in the same way. Mm-hmm. Which isn't to say that their position is excellent and good, but just to say that they're different. Yeah, it's different.
That's all that you're saying. Yeah, now, I think.
The other thing that happens too is that she then collects the reported what they say, what these people with schizophrenia say they're seeing, right? And generally, they'll be like, well, it's a spirit of the river talking to me, or it's an imaginary, it's not an imaginary friend, but it's a friend who's a demigod, or it's this object is talking to me. And when you ask, well, what are they saying? What are these things telling you to do? Oftentimes it's like perform strange rituals, right? Or they're giving me silly jokes, or I can ignore them, right? Again, it's not a benign experience. I'm not trying to say that this is.
I don't hear you as minimizing.
But for the sake of our audiences, I want to stress that. But like in any event, the valences of schizophrenic ideation in these other contexts are not as they're not what she finds in the North American social democratic one.
Yes.
And in this North American social democratic context, well, first let's just state a simple, straightforward, empirical fact, people with any kind of mental illness are, as a rule, vastly more likely to be the victims of violence, both domestic and interpersonal, but also at the hands of state authorities, than anyone else in the population, right? Overall, right? They're disproportionately targeted, right? And if you add in additional compounding factors and comorbidities, like people who have other disabilities or people who are people of color, right, in certain identity categories, they're hyper exposed to that type of violence. In places that are, Western chauvinists might say are much more civilized, much more in tune with diagnostic categories and have all these institutions and medications, schizophrenics are much more likely to report hearing voices telling them to kill themselves or kill other people, telling them that their lives are worthless. They're not voices that are grounded in like a local tree or a temple, but instead they're just something that they hear as though on the radio, etc. And I think we could draw a bunch of different data points from this, or a bunch of different sort of like hypotheses or suggestions from this. And I won't speak for what Lerman herself does. We could note, for example, that like clearly cultural conditions change, technology conditions change, and this is reflected in the experiences of people in such conditions. But also, if we bear in mind that data point, or I just stipulated earlier, about how people with acute mental illness are acutely vulnerable to violence, and we look at the situation of people in tent cities and of the unhoused in Toronto, in California, elsewhere, they are constantly being brutalized. They exist on the margins, and there is every possible at every possible turn. I think you're that of Jesse Waters as a successor to Tucker Carlson, right? Describing, I think the phrase was like worthless bags of flesh, like talking about these people, right? And you realize that these human beings who have schizophrenia are not actually living in a parallel fantasy world, right? They're not disconnected from reality, right? And moreover, they are on some, and also too, they're treated as threats, right? Yes. There's a disproportionate number of the people who are basically summarily extrajudicially killed by American police are in acute mental health crisis. Either they're schizophrenic or they're having a psychotic break or they're otherwise distressed. Mm-hmm. So in other words, they are treated as though they are clear and present dangers and inevitably going to be violent. And they're also treated as being disposable, worthless people who don't have a right to exist in an occupied space. So it should, I think you could see how, we don't know if we want to invoke a collective unconscious, or they're simply being sensitized to stuff that other people, particularly in North America, would like to not say or say out loud and own as a good thing. But they're picking up on messages about how they're treated socially. Even their supposedly disordered fantasies actually give back to us in the mode of a representative symptom, ubiquitous ideologies of human disposability and justifications of their precarity. So I think that, like, I don't know how chronically the social services, like, I can't speak to policy and stuff in Toronto or in a lot of other places, but it does seem to me that, like, this acute crisis and these spectacles of human misery are being produced by a social and economic system that is violent.
Yeah.
And their violence, to the extent to which that's a thing that happens, or at least, and I'm not absolving anyone of any kind of responsibility here, nor am I diminishing the need for real policies to help care for people who are in acute risk of harming themselves and others. But that any violence that's put on them or that's being described as emanating from them really is, at the end of the day, the tailing end of a whole series of compounded acts of violence and neglect that inevitably and understandably have the output of people acting out. Right? If enough people tell you that you are horrible and it's only a matter of time before you hurt someone or yourself, like, well, I don't know. It's hard not to. It certainly seems almost inhumanly cruel to understand these people as, quote unquote, these people who are violent of their own and just like a problem that we need to deal with. And I think we could even say that part of what's underwriting a lot of that cruelty from people like Jesse Waters and otherwise is that they're also picking up on a kind of anxiety, right? I think one of the other features of neoliberal precarity is that everyone walks around being like, there for the other step. Like literally you have to step over a human being in crisis to get to your job. And you might be like, well, there for the grace of God go I. And one way that people parsimoniously psychically metabolize that is by being like, this person is a madman. They're different from me.
Right.
I could never have this happen to me. And when the hyperpunitive things happen
which
to
is
them,
absolutely not the case.
yes, exactly. When these hyperpunitive things happen to them, that's because they deserved it. They must have done something. And I think we can read that as a symptomatic disavowal of anxiety that we have, that,
Or as a reaction formation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever happens in Toronto, and I hope it needs to treat people like people who have the right to be housed and have the right for their suffering to be heard. And for I'm sorry, but the amount of op-eds I see when I'm in San Francisco or New York, where it's all people testifying like, I'm a small business owner or I live here, and let me tell you about my experience of feeling threatened by such people. And sometimes there are horrible stories that serve as the immediate warrant for that. I don't think I've ever seen an op-ed by a person with a mental illness being like, here's how I feel threatened and scared where I live. And I think it's that simple foreclosure that we need to deal with.
The question asker seems to be asking two things. One, feels like one question is can psychoanalysis either help us see this problem better, which I think you just articulated really well. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Also, can neoliberal society solve this problem? And it sounds to me like you're saying at a baseline, the material conditions that are producing the desperation are the things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think that's right. What I should say though too at the same time, and here I actually can invoke an example from Canada, right, is that obviously I think the distress of disposable people, right, could be, and our distress about their distress could be alleviated if we had a different social, economic, and also ideological regime that did not make people disposable in the first place and did not result in distress equals guy with gun showing up equals somebody getting killed, right? Those linkages need to be broken. But I also should say, a total revolution probably wouldn't. People who are living in the streets would probably not do very well when the streets are also battlefields, right? So I'm not gesturing towards an impossible alternative, but I will say, and I want to recommend one group of psychoanalysts, which is the group that's known as GIIRFRIC, GIIRFRIC, who work in Montreal and Quebec City.
Yeah.
And what they do using Lacanian psychoanalytic theory is that they do inpatient communities of people who are schizophrenic or having psychotic sort of episodes in long periods of their time, long periods of their life. They live together. They do therapy. They manage household responsibilities. And this is one of the few, there's an article by Lucy Cantin, Cantin, which I can link to describing this. But this has been found, I think about 10 years ago by the Canadian government to be this specifically psychoanalytic group therapy has been found to be better in terms of long-term prognoses than either supportive psychotherapy or medication management, and thus is covered by the Canadian healthcare system. So I mean, that may have changed under Trudeau or whatever, but I do think that there are resources for and
models.
Yeah,
I
models.
think is what you're talking about now, right? These are the two. I mean, I think that was what Dan was getting at by being like, you answered this one part of this question, but the other part is a question not simply of resources or of using analytic terms to think about the social order, but actually what are the specifically mental health interventions that are possible given the conditions that do currently obtain.
And so, I point to that and some work by Patricia Garavici on psychoanalysis in the barrio, whereas but suffice it to say, yes. So we don't have to overthrow neoliberalism to provide immediate level, much better care for people who need immediate, much better care.
Yeah.
And I do think liberationist psychoanalytic approaches that actually dignify the suffering of the severely mentally ill are there, and they're proven, and we should lean into that. So I hope we do.
Yeah. We're going to wind up for today with one more caller who has responded to our continual and ongoing request for you to share our dreams. And I will say that we did in our first mailbag episode, which is on Patreon, we listened to a dream and then we talked for like an hour about the interpretation of dreams. So we're not going to do that here, but that is where you can go. And if you're interested in listening to what we have to say about, like, we can't interpret your dreams, but we can talk a little bit about how to interpret dreams. So we're going to kind of end with this and offer it up to you as our listeners, and also people who are, you know, in our Discord and whatnot. We'll offer a few thoughts, but we're not going to do anything that is definitive, because we are all here Freudian enough to think that there is no decoding method that will allow someone without access to either greater information about the caller than we have, or, you know, who is, whether it's like an actual analytic relationship to them, or who can, you know, follow up with them on their trains of association. So we will speculate, but we're not going to do more than that.
We didn't dream it, so we can't know it.
We can't incept into it.
Okay, so this caller has
a recurring dream that I had ever since I did a treatment of nicotine patches, and it's kind of changed over time, but relatively stayed the same ever since. And it basically happens every time I wake up or I'm about to wake up, and I'll be suddenly finding myself in like completely white space. The only way I can think of to describe it is like that one episode of SpongeBob where Squidward breaks the time machine and then turns the complete void, and there's like an empty silhouette. And there's a figure who my friends coined the term wake up man for, because every time I would see him, he would speak to me in the voice of Kanye West very specifically. Just 2 words every time, wake up. And then I would wake up, and this happened pretty consistently every morning before I would wake up. And over time, it sort of changed. The wake up man is no longer there. I sort of attribute this to my nicotine patches. I don't know why it persisted after, because they do give you weird dreams, but I don't know. Then it sort of changed to me trying to outsmart this figure that's trying to get me to not wake up at the time that I want to wake up. And then I find that I've overslept.
So first of all, we do have to I feel like, invoke a line that we have already invoked on this podcast so many times, which is Freud in the interpretation of dreams, saying that dreams are the guardians of sleep. Right. So there is part of this dream that is keeping you asleep, which you should, you know, probably like thank the dream for in some ways.
I'm just sitting here with like a vision of like the holodeck or something, and there's Kanye saying, wake up. And I don't know what to...
I don't know that it is Kanye. Exactly.
I mean, the only thing this is the only thing I can think of, but I'll just say from all my clinician friends who've done work with people in substance recovery and stuff, is that the one dream that apparently comes back to people specifically who've given up cigarettes and stuff is dreaming about smoking. And in a way that like that comes back years and years later, in a way in which people even have like oftentimes had, like, this is anecdotal, of course, but people
really,
people who've had like heroin addiction and stuff, so like don't dream about scoring heroin as anywhere near as much as people who have given up cigarettes. I can speak for myself on this. Like, I've dreamed about cigarettes. I haven't had a cigarette in like 20 years, but like it is.
I never dream about cigarettes, and I was a very dedicated smoker until I, gave up cigarettes. Oh, well,
you gave up cigarettes?
Oh my God. I have a cigarette like 4 times a year.
Okay. I'm just saying. I'm
did.
not holding you to it. I'm just saying.
I did. I quit smoking.
Okay.
I mean, I had a pack a day habit for like a very long time.
That's very good.
And then I stopped smoking for like 5 years. And now, again, I have one very, very occasionally.
Right.
So are you saying that because I occasionally have a cigarette, that's why I don't have dreams about cigarettes?
I'm not saying, I'm just asking questions here.
I think it's really interesting that this dream occurs right before waking up. And it's like, it sounds like it's so routine, it's predictable. One, I have a question about like, what's your ringtone? Like what's waking you up in the morning? What sound? Because I remember when I was in college, I used to have like my favorite song as my alarm clock. And I was like, this is going to be the coolest thing. I'm going to wake up feeling so great because I'm going to hear this song. And then like a month into that, I hated that band. And I've never liked that band ever since then. So, sorry, it was Blink-182. Got ruined for me because of waking up in the morning. Yeah, can't do it. But yeah, I can't think of a more apt voice to beckon me into 2023's reality than like the fusion of our pop and political cultures in Kanye West.
We AI some of that up, actually.
Yeah, potent combo.
But I think we're all missing. We're not seeing the forest for like the Kanye trees here, which is like the heart of this dream is not necessarily wake up man, although it seems important, but the void.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that is actually very, very interesting. Like that the dream would have like an absence at its heart.
Yeah. And the absence of cigarettes or the absence of, we don't know if this person smoked cigarettes. I mean, we know they did nicotine patches, but
I assume that's.
I guess the one thing I also wonder about, and this is a question that only the person who called in would know the answer to, is was their routine when they were smoking to have a cigarette first thing at the beginning of a day? Because it's been a long time.
Because then it's the dream is the substitute.
Yeah, the dream is a substitute, but also like I will say for that brief period of time when I was smoking, that first cigarette of the day,
nothing like it.
Nothing like it.
Oh God,
nothing like it.
So good.
Yeah.
Well, maybe on that note, if folks in the Discord want to throw this around, I would love to read some interpretations.
We're not encouraging you to smoke. Though.
Yeah, don't smoke.
Really
Don't smoke.
It up.
Well, I might be. Go ahead, smoke a cigarette. How dare you?
No, Dan. Not in an age of a, respiratory virus pandemic.
Maybe honestly, Wake Up Man just wants people to start using nicotine patches more, and we've done his bidding.
Did we just write a Nicorette commercial? I think so.
Yeah, or like a sequel to Insidious, also like astrally projecting. And
did we answer this person's? Do we say anything meaningful about this?
Can we answer it?
Maybe we did. I don't know. They're going to find some meaning in this. Maybe. I mean, yeah. I think we need to know what the list. I want. Okay, questions for our listeners. One, what does this dream activate in you? Just first off the bat, you don't have to like solve it. It's not a clue. It's not a riddle. Just what does it do for you? 2, do you smoke? And if so, do you have dreams about cigarettes? 3, have you given up smoking? And do you still have dreams about cigarettes? 4, have you met Wake Up Man in your dreams?
5, can I bum a cigarette?
Can I have you bum a cigarette even though she's quit smoking? 6, is Wake Up Man with you right now? 7, are you sure he's not with you right now?
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for calling. Again, if you do call, let me know if it's cool to actually play your vocals on the air, because I feel like that generally makes for a better listener experience. But we are, trying to in the absence of that knowledge, we're trying to protect your privacy. Thank you so much for being with us today. Please rate and review Ordinary Unhappiness on all of your podcast platforms. We keep this ad-free by being a Patreon-supported podcast. So if you are so inclined and you are enjoying this pod and want some more additional content, including us reading through the entirety of the standard edition of Freud, plus our spicier paywall takes, you can support us on patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. One more thing before we go, folks. If this podcast is up your alley, we also think you might enjoy an event that is upcoming and being put on by our good friends at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research on Friday and Saturday, July 14th and 15th. It is being put on by Besser, the Goethe Institute New York, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and N+1 magazine, taking the occasion of the 100th year anniversary of the Frankfurt School to ask, what does critical theory look like 100 years on, and what does it do? So this is going to be a 2-day symposium. There's going to be panels on the topics of the Frankfurt School and contemporary culture, critical theory from below, race, gender, and the Frankfurt School, and critical theory for the 21st century. There's definitely going to be a lot of content about psychoanalysis, critical theory, social theory. Sayla Ben Habib will be there, Moira Weigel, Adam Schatz, Ajay Singh Chaudhry, Samantha Hill, Rebecca Ariel Port, Lauren Dent, and so many more wonderful people. And it's going to be in New York City, but it will also stream live to the Besser Facebook page. It is free to attend, and I will put a link in the show notes to register. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll be back next week. Bye.
Love you.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.